counseling, frustration being normal in relationships, having to work together instead of just coast, are things that aren't really a part of our cultural narrative of relationships. Relationships are hard inherently, and there's no real one-size-fits-all answer or formula for like the perfect couple. So there's no, do this and this and this and everything will be fine no matter what. All relationships are different, but some relationships are more different than others. So that's our topic today. We all know inherently that autism affects relationships.
I want to start up a conservation.
Autistic people often have to work harder than non-autistic people to navigate social situations, social relationships, and romantic relationships. I found, though, that autistic people can learn to do things that come naturally to non-autistic people through rote memory and effort, though it takes self-awareness and that level of work. Though I also want to say that autistics aren't the only ones with problems in relationships, and it takes two to communicate and two to have a communication problem. I feel that all too often the burden of relationships in neurodiverse couples is placed on the autistic person to understand the neurotypical world, to adapt and communicate better. Whereas really, like Kristen and David Finch were talking about, it's about coming together and understanding each other. Non-autistic people have just as much trouble empathizing with autistic people as autistic people do empathizing with non-autistic people. The burden to communicate correctly is often placed only on autistic people, and I feel this isn't accurate or helpful. And really, I feel that neurologically mixed relationships, romantic or otherwise, can be compared to two conflicting cultures trying to interact. So, while this stuff is hard in relationships between two autistic people, it can sometimes be even harder when only one person is autistic because of this culture clash aspect. It's important for non-autistic people in the autism community to understand that we live in a neurotypical culture. Our dominant society is neurotypical as the normal. And so, that's where we teach autistic people to adapt to our neurotypical culture. If you're uncomfortable with physical greetings, it's more important to teach kids to shake hands even if it's painful than it is for them to say, oh, I'm not comfortable with handshakes. A lot of the difficulties in empathy in these types of situations are, about these cultural problems. So today, we're going to be telling the story of neurologically mixed relationships in 3 chapters. So the first is I'm going to be exploring how neurotype affects social interaction and social culture in general, some traits of both autism and non-autism. Then number 2, getting into how these neurotypes affect more intimate relationships. I'm going to be talking about romantic relationships, but this can apply to parent-child relationships, friendships, coworkers, roommates, people you cohabitate with. And then finally, tools and techniques for navigating these relationships. So, first, neurotype and culture, and how these types of traits, can kind of create a culture. So this is something that I first heard as an analogy from Dr. Stephen Shore, if any of you are familiar with him, that he once said that he feels one of the reasons he connected so well with his wife when they first met is that they both knew what it was like to be cultural outsiders, him being on the autism spectrum and her having just immigrated from China. And that really stuck with me, and I thought it was a very apt analogy. They were both cultural outsiders. So we're going to start with traits of autism that affect social relationships. I feel that a lot of the disabling aspects of autism, especially in situations where you have someone who, casts for normal but still struggles, are environment expectations, things like this that can be connected to these traits, things that aren't as much of a problem when it's 2 autistic people talking, but can become a huge blow-up when someone involved isn't autistic. So the first I want to talk about, because I feel like it's a big one that affects so many aspects of autistic experience, is what's called weak central coherence. Central coherence is basically the brain's ability to take details and put them together into a whole, a big picture. So, the forest for the trees analogy, where neurotypical people or non-autistic people will see a forest. To an autistic person, a forest is a collection of trees, and either it won't occur to them that there is such a thing as a forest, or if you're explaining it to them, it still is just a collection of trees. This is one reason why autistic people are famously bad at summarizing things or being concise, because autistic people process and explain in units of detail instead of in a big picture way. This is a good thing when it comes to learning complex information or, dealing with a kid who's asked why over and over again. I'll always have an answer ready because I can break things down small forever. It's a bad thing if, you're telling a joke from memory or you're trying to give directions to somebody. I like that something Temple Grandin sometimes says is that she believes this is why autistic people have such a natural capacity for expertise. That she says, and I feel at least this is true for me also, that to understand something, she has to know every piece of it because she can't have a general understanding. She can't just get the gist. So she doesn't understand something at all until she knows all the pieces, and then she's an expert. The second trait is impaired cognitive empathy. So we've all heard that autistic people struggle with empathy, but really empathy is a large umbrella term, and there's more than one kind of empathy. The type of empathy that autistic people usually struggle with is cognitive empathy, better known as theory of mind. That's, the ability to know what someone is feeling and, put yourself in their shoes and all that kind of stuff. Whereas emotional empathy is being able to feel something in response to another person's emotional experience. I found, while I was researching for this, a really great 2006 study on adults instead of kids. I was happy to find an adult one that compared autistic adults to their non-autistic counterparts, and they found that autistic adults scored lower on cognitive empathy, though they were able to score normally when given detailed information about the experience they were supposed to be empathizing with, but they also scored about equal on emotional empathy and significantly higher on a specific type of emotional empathy called personal distress empathy, which they defined as self-oriented feelings of anxiety and discomfort in response to negative emotions in someone else. So I've personally worked really hard since my diagnosis to compensate for these types of empathy deficits. I've learned to continually check in with myself and overcome my self-awareness problems with emotion, and I try to analyze and check in on people around me and watch if there's something I should be picking up on. And I have gotten a lot more empathetic, at least, using that rote memory, conscious manual transmission brain to empathize with people. But I still have a really hard time correctly identifying and understanding emotional states in others in a cognitive empathy way. And my usual go-to story for this is, once upon a time, years ago, I was dating a nerd, and I went over to his apartment, and he and his roommates were setting up to play a card game in the kitchen. And one of them said, she had homework, so she couldn't play, so she's gathering up her dinner dishes, and I'm getting dinner, so we're walking around the kitchen at the same time. And I started feeling really stressed, like this dark cloud, like something's wrong. And for one, wow, my self-awareness skills, I could tell something was wrong. And two, I eventually noticed it felt like it was coming from her, that she had this dark cloud around her and seemed angry or something. So I started thinking, oh my God, I showed up and she got angry, like she doesn't like me. I'm overstaying my welcome. I'm coming over to the apartment too much. Oh, I'm having part of their communal dinner, and that's probably not the greatest thing. And so I'm getting more and more stressed, whatever. She goes to do her thing, and I sit down at the table to play a card game, and I'm still really upset. What did I do wrong? Whatever. Roommates hate me. And after like 10 minutes or so, she comes back in the kitchen, and she says, oh, God, I'm so mad about this stupid paper I have to write. Like, we never do fun together as a roomie family, and the one time it happens, I can't play. I have homework. Like, oh my God, she's mad that she has to write a paper. This had nothing to do with me. But this is what I mean by personal distress empathy. I was able to pick up that something was wrong through like practice and paying attention. And then when I did pick up that something was wrong, it made me feel bad, and I made it all about myself, autism, auto, self, whatever. And I didn't have the cognitive empathy skills to connect the dots and say, oh my God, she has homework. That's a much better explanation. I, responded to her anger, but not in an effective way. And I do find that most autistics who have little to no cognitive empathy still have this strong emotional, personal distress empathy response. And I've encountered a lot of autistic people who describe themselves as emotional sponges. And this is, I think the reason why so many autistic people respond to emotionally charged situations by shutting down. If you're yelling at your spouse and they're shutting down, it's not because they don't care. It's because, they're an emotional sponge. The next trait I want to talk about is lack of self-awareness, which goes to the previous one a little bit. Lack of self-awareness can also play into the cognitive empathy one, but it's about, the clinical term for this that I found that I like is alexithymia, which I have all these terms I'm using will be on handouts that will get emailed to you after the conference, so I don't think I wrote that on the slides, but don't worry about how to spell it. But alexithymia is difficulty in recognizing and labeling emotional states in yourself, but I tend to use it to stretch it to physical states in yourself also, because I feel like something that often happens when you make a weird face for a long time and not know you're making a weird face, and that's a lack of self-awareness. A lot of problems that autistic adults encounter in my experience, including me, is that, this happens in kids too, autistic people won't often notice that they have social problems or sensory problems because of this lack of self-awareness, alexithymia. I didn't know I had sensory problems that were different from normal until I started researching autism. Like, I always knew that I was really sensitive to lights, and my friends who turn up the radio too loud, I would jump and be in pain, but I didn't know that was abnormal. Then the next one, kind of related to that, is sensory processing differences. Sensory processing differences aren't only about being easily overwhelmed by things that non-autistic people don't think twice about, but sensory issues I find can cause seemingly odd social behaviors and reactions. So not only, wearing what Stephen Shore calls the autism uniform of a brimmed hat, but say someone who jumps when their coworker gives them a friendly clap on the back, or someone who doesn't feel comfortable shaking hands, because for me personally, I've trained myself to do it, I've gotten pretty good at it, but I'm still much more likely to forget someone's name if they tell me their name while they're shaking my hand, because I can't do both at the same time. Shaking someone's hand is very, very overwhelming. And the next one is perseveration and inertia. I'm putting these together because they're pretty closely linked. How many of you have heard the word perseveration before? Yeah, good. A few years ago, 5 years ago, no one had heard it, and I like it so much better than the other weird abstract terms people would use to try to describe this, because perseveration encompasses so many different things. It's, the fancy psychiatric term for cognitive looping, which results in fixation, repetition. And then inertia is part of this, sort of. It relates to attention shifting and motor planning difficulties, and we'll get to that later. And the last one is conversation being info-centered. This is one of the most common sources of tension in interactions between autistic people and non-autistic people, I think. That we'll also get more into this in the next section, but this is something I didn't even notice until a few years ago. I was dating a neurotypical guy who could not even talk to my mother because she was just autistic enough that this style of conversation was really confusing and upsetting to him. But anyway, now we're going to talk about something called allism, which, has anyone here heard the word allism before? Yeah, Alex, I've probably told you the word already. Allism is a relatively new term that I really like, because everyone knows the word neurotypical, but neurotypical doesn't necessarily refer to someone who's not autistic, it just means, well, it originally meant autistic, but it implies that if you're not autistic, you're neurologically typical, which isn't necessarily the case. So the word allism comes from the Greek word allos, meaning other. So like allergy or allegory, allism refers to other-oriented. And someone could be not neurotypical but allistic if they're not autistic. So say someone who's ADHD, OCD, dyslexic, but doesn't meet the criteria for autism, doesn't have these types of autistic traits. So from now on, I'm going to use this and neurotypical interchangeably, but sometimes if I mean non-neurotypical but not autistic, I'll use this word too. It's sort of like a rectangle and square. Every neurotypical is allistic, but not every allistic is neurotypical. So the first trait of allism is other-centered conversation. This is something I had to be taught very explicitly, and this is what I was doing wrong, talking to my ex-boyfriend's family, that this is one of those sort of white whales of autistic social connection. I find that like 99% of my issues socializing with autistic people comes back to this, and it's true that not every Alice conversation is about the other, and every autistic conversation is about information, and there's some overlap, but in general, I'm referring to the type of conversation that each group thinks of as being relevant to social bonding. So one thing I notice, and this included me in the past, is that most autistic people don't know what small talk is or what it's for. I did not understand small talk until I read Desmond's book, People Watching, which, again, I have a million handouts that are going to be emailed to you after, but I have a list of resources that includes that book. But that he described small talk as the grooming display. He's a zoologist who writes about people. So, you would say an anthropologist, but he uses like a zoology lens. So he describes small talk as, what does he say, similar to the social grooming process of monkeys and apes, serving to demonstrate vocally our pleasure at the meeting by paying compliments, showing concern, and showing pleasure. And he admits that, for example, the question, how are you, is an empty question. And it doesn't really matter what the other person says because it's a type of social grooming. It's a type of, it's a care demonstration. And it's about how people like to be cared for. So, ever since I learned this, I've gotten a lot better at dealing with, cashiers who want to make small talk. It's not about how are you. And that's why something I used to struggle with a lot, and trouble for, is people would say, how are you? Oh, I'm good, thanks. Or what my mom says is, just fine, thank you. The problem is then I wouldn't say, how are you, which then seems really self-centered. Because it's not about how you are, it's about trading the how are you, how are you? The next, first I forgot I had a little note about this, that the way I remembered it and the way that various neurotypical exes explained it to me is that when you're talking with a non-autistic person, you are the star of their conversation. So they are supposed to be the star of your conversation. And a problem I would encounter a lot, still do sometimes because I'm not amazing at this, is that you'll get in a situation where the allistic person is focusing on you and you are focusing on the topic. So you get stuck in a loop where the conversation keeps coming back to you and you feel like trapped in an interrogation, or you even notice and you're talking about something you're interested in, and the other person feels like they're trying super hard to draw you out and you're not giving anything back. So, a lot of this is just about asking leading questions that aren't yes or no. Like, my favorite is, what do you do for work? Because even if someone hates their job, they'll love to talk about it because then they can claim. So, the next one, calling honesty is rude. Because another thing that autistic people often don't understand, and that it took me a long time to understand, is why being direct and, blunt. They'd say that autistic people are blunt to the point of rudeness, so I would say, why is being blunt rude if I'm not directly insulting someone? That Steven Pinker is a psychologist who studies language, who has a really great talk online that's easily Googleable. I think I have it in the handouts, they'll be emailed. He has a great little spiel about how communication, or what he says, effective language is meant to communicate a message and negotiate a social relationship between the two parties. So it's not just about imparting the information. It has to be somewhat other-centered because it's a negotiation. That the literal words have to conform to the safest relationship between the two people. So, it's up to the recipient to interpret on their own what the second message is that could threaten the relationship. So, for example, this is where, if someone offers to get you something, being direct is rude. If your friend says, I'm going to the store, do you want anything? Saying, get me a Diet Coke, or oh yeah, get me a Diet Coke, is rude because it's in order. And the polite thing to do is a non-literal, nonsensical opinion. Oh, I'd love a Diet Coke. Which doesn't actually communicate anything directly. It's not a yes or no. The assumption is that, if your friend cares about you, the desired outcome for them is for you to get what you want. So it transforms an order into a polite, do this, to could you do this? The autistic person says, yes, I could. Do you want me to do something? But I saw a great example of this a few months ago when I was doing a talk in an episode of Mad Men. A man says to his business partner, I'd hate to think of you as my adversary, which means you are my adversary, but because we are equals, I can openly challenge you, or that would threaten the safest relationship between them. They have to coexist. The next one is nonverbal signaling is taken for granted. As I have always heard, and probably some or most of you all have always heard, everyone always says only 10% of communication is verbal. And I always laughed at this because I didn't want to think I was missing that much. The more I learn about this and the more time I spend around allistic people, and the more I think it's true. It's tricky though, because even allistic people don't know really what body language means and can't effectively teach it because it's unconscious. That autistic people tend to think of body language as, shrugging, or smiling and frowning, turning away when you don't talk to someone and stuff like that. But supposedly, according to, neuropsychologists and stuff, down to as small as, pupil dilation is picked up unconsciously and given meaning. So a lot of these signals are interpreted unconsciously in a way that autistic people need to consciously learn them to interpret them. Autistic people need to use declarative rote memory for these things that allistic people instantaneously just feel and know. So, since studying this, I've learned, you can look at a couple and know how long they've been together and what their relationship is like just by looking at them. You can know just by looking whether a boy escorting an old woman across the street is helping his grandmother or a total stranger. And these are things that allistic people, even when they're well-meaning, can't always control how they're interpreting. So, the problem that will happen is that even the most well-meaning allistic who knows that an autistic person is autistic will still feel uncomfortable with abnormal eye contact because of that intuitive thing. And a way that one of my neurotypical